Welcome to the podcast, Tanya.
Thanks, Jade.
Alrighty, let's dive in. Let's get a little technical for a minute. Let's dive into the different layers of the stomach muscles. And some people may not be aware that there are different layers of the stomach muscles and they have different roles. If you could explain to the listeners exactly, what those muscles are, what their functions are, and then we might go from there. Because we did cover a lot of ground then.
Sure, yeah. So with the abs, there's multiple layers. The deepest abdominal muscle layer is called your transversus abdominis, and these muscles actually wrap horizontally around and they act like a corset. So when they tighten, they draw your stomach in, they flatten it and draw your waist in. So they give you a nice flat tummy and, a defined narrow waist, but more importantly, they stabilize all of the spinal joints. So that's the deepest core layer, and those muscles need to be activated before you do any exercise in Pilates. So before you're doing an ab exercise, an arm, a leg exercise, every exercise, those muscles need to be activated before you even move. And the instructors are there to help people make sure that that's happening. And they work with the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor are a sling. They sit down at the bottom of the pelvis. Females are often aware of their pelvic floor because they might do, some Kegel or pelvic floor exercises at home. But for those people that aren't, men have them too. Those muscles just like lift up and they support the pelvis and they help the deep abdominals to engage. So they work together. And as you know, obviously we've catchphrased the term T-zone, which refers to an imaginary T on the front of the pelvis. And it's an analogy to think of to draw the pelvic floor up and to flatten and draw the hip bones in and flatten the tummy to activate that T-zone. So that's the deepest layer. And if you don't have that layer on, you won't get flat stomach and you won't support your spine and your back. So, and then on top of that, you can't just stop there. So you say you hurt your back, you go to a physio, they might give you some TA exercises and that's great. Not super functional on their own though, because no muscle works in isolation of the others in the body. It all works together as a, well-defined machine. So we need to make sure that the obliques, which sit on top of that and run obliquely, they're the ones that rotate you. They're also the ones that stop your back from arching during exercises. They're the ones that work hard when we breathe out, which is why there's a breath out for every movement. When we curl up and do abs, when we do anything effortful, it's to help those abdominals engage. So they're also important for stability and they're the ones that stop your back arching, which obviously is going to help back pain. And then the most superficial ones are the ones that people, sometimes want to have stick out, which are their six-pack abs or rectus abdominis. They don't hugely play a role in stabilizing the back, but they will also help your back from arching a little bit as well. So they're the different layers. And, a lot of people when they do sit-ups at the gym, they just really focus on those six-pack muscles and they do hundreds and hundreds of crunches, but it doesn't help their back and they may never get a flat stomach. So it's really important to make sure that all those muscles are activating correctly, which is why we talk about things like the T-zone. We have breathing involved. It helps the abdominals to activate. The breath's not just thrown in there just so that you don't stop breathing and die. Of course, you need to breathe, but each breath is in there for a reason. It's to actually help the movement and to help the abs to activate.
And does the diaphragm play a role in that, that core activation as well?
Yeah. I didn't mention the diaphragm, but obviously it sits in there as well. And it's involved in breathing too. But all of it combines together to, create a core. And the reason why those muscles help stabilize you is not only do they attach onto your actual vertebrae, but also, when you breathe, your abdominal pressure changes and your pelvic floor kind of lifts up from the bottom. Your deep abdominals, your transversus and your obliques kind of draw your stomach in and your diaphragm from the top. And when you have that increased pressure in the abdominal cavity with the muscles all working properly together, it also creates that stability as well.
Yeah,
so,
nice.
Yeah.
And, I guess if someone's in the gym just training those rectus abdominis, those six-pack muscles, what can be the consequence of that? Is there any negative consequence to overtraining, one particular set of or layer of abdominals?
It can, not for everybody, but for some people it can cause problems. If those muscles get really tight, it puts you more at risk of having the muscles separate, for example, during pregnancy. Or, sometimes if there's a lot of, if you have a bit of a belly, that can happen as well. But if those ones get too tight, it can also change your posture in your lower back and can have you be more in a rounded lower back position. But if they get too tight and you're not using the ones underneath, basically those ones can't stabilize you. So if you get super strong in those muscles at the expense of the strength of the deeper muscles, back pain can arise from that in itself. So you want to make sure that all of the muscles are working together. It's not like the six-pack muscles are bad. They're just the least likely to be able to support your back because they don't attach onto your spine anyway.
And we've, of course, I guess, a catchphrase, for that T zone, determining, I guess, relating to that transversus abdominis and pelvic floor. And, what's the importance of actually, getting hands-on, feeling that T zone, the instructor doing that throughout the exercise, throughout each workout? Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, when you touch a muscle, first and foremost, it actually helps your brain become aware of where you want it to tighten. So, facilitating touching of any muscle, not just your abdominals, really gives you some tactile feedback for your brain to, use the right neural pathways and actually activate that muscle. So it helps clients immensely when you do put hands on muscles for them to be able to think about where they should be tightening and feeling, what they need to be doing. But a lot of people don't know if their abs are engaging properly. It can even be good for clients to put their hands on their own abs when they can, obviously, within exercises that they're able to do that, or just even practicing at home, just so that they themselves can know the difference between good and bad. Because if you do a whole heap of ab exercises without them being activated, you're really losing an opportunity to get the maximum or really most benefit or any benefit from the exercise. There's no point doing tons of ab exercises if your abdominals are popping out, bulging and doming. You really need to keep them flat and keep the T-zone engaged.
Yeah, very good. And I think, that carryover of keeping that T zone, it's really that core first policy, activating the T zone, getting that woken up, getting that really activated, because that then carries over to every other exercise that we're doing in a class. And then that then carries over to everyday life as well. Can you talk to us about, I guess, what can inhibit that T zone, that
Sure.
transversus abdominis, and then what is the knock-on effect of that?
Yeah. Firstly, just made me think of something else. So, that's why in every exercise, before we start the movement, the cues will be inhale T zone, exhale, and then do the movement, just so that people engage it before they move, because it should actually switch on before you start the exercise. And same as in everyday life, it should automatically, for people whose T zones work properly, they kind of automatically switch on before you go and lift up that bag or pick up your child or whatever it is that you're going to be doing. People that don't have back pain, those muscles automatically switch on. But for people who do have back pain, it's a chicken egg, sometimes the weak abdominals will cause the back pain in the first place. But once you do hurt your back, it's kind of a catch-22. You really need the muscles even more to be activated when you do have a sore back, but the pain often and the swelling and inflammation often inhibits the muscles. They switch off. So, you might have someone who had extremely strong abdominals and then were in some kind of a traumatic accident and ended up with a back injury. Those muscles can immediately just switch off and become really hard to activate. There's been lots and lots of research in the physio realm about that. So switching those muscles back on if you do have back pain is really important. And to prevent back pain also in the first place, it's important.
So then it's, a matter if we've experienced an injury during training or, everyday life, like you said, like a car accident or a fall or something like that, then going back to basics sometimes and just focusing on that transversus abdominis and that activation, something that our studio Pilates clients do in the very first session, in that orientation workout, going back, doing a whole bunch of repetitions of that is advisable, yeah?
Absolutely. And practicing at home can help as well. But, when you first start Pilates, if you're doing tons of exercises and the muscles aren't working, you're not really getting the benefit. So, that's why when you first start, you do need to go through, some basic exercises, do the orientation, learn how to activate the muscles, and make sure that they're actually working. Because for some people, they don't automatically switch on and they really have to focus on it and practice and really think about it and get a lot of feedback and help from their instructor as well. Yeah.
Let's talk about for a second, some other areas within the body, so let's talk about, for example, the glutes and how they stabilize the lower limb, biomechanics and function,
Yep.
and how that correlates then through to maybe some sports and everyday movements.
Sure. Look, the glutes are just as important as the abs, and they're often forgotten a little bit, I feel, in talking about injuries. Because, each time you stand on one leg when you walk, when you step on one leg, your pelvis should be parallel and straight to the floor, and your belt line should be parallel to the floor. So what your buttocks do is when you stand on one leg, they stop the other hip from dropping, and they keep your pelvis straight and still. Now you can think, if one hip drops, your back's going to be affected. And then your shoulders might, go skew-whiff to compensate, and then your neck might end up being affected. So it's quite interesting that even people who have things like shoulder pain and neck pain, as well as back pain, strengthening the glutes can be the thing that actually fixes the shoulder or neck pain. That was, for me, that was me for years, growing up with swimming, and I'd get sore neck and shoulders, and I'd do all the shoulder and neck exercises in the world. It wasn't until I did Pilates and strengthened my glutes that it fixed the problem, because it was coming from below. But also the glutes stop the knees rolling in when you're walking, when you're running. So anyone that gets like knee pain, shin splints, Achilles, hips, anything, the glutes really need to be strong. And same as with the abs, there's multiple layers. There's not just one buttock muscle. There's a whole, there's quite a few of them in there that all do different things, but all very, very important to prevent all types of injuries.
Let's talk about some of those smaller buttock muscles, because I guess most people think, buttock muscles, you think gluteus maximus, the big one, the one that,
The booty.
the shape,
Yeah.
Talk to us about some of the other smaller ones and the function that they play and how that correlates to, keep improving and preventing back pain.
Sure. Well, the gluteus maximus, obviously the one at the back, extends your hip. So it will kick your leg back behind you. If you're squatting down and you're standing up, it'll extend your hip to stand up. So they're the ones that kind of work when you do squats. So people who've done a lot of gym work, that's probably the main glute muscle they'll have worked on before. But in the gym, you probably don't work a huge amount of the other glute muscles specifically, which in Pilates, booty burner. It works all of the muscles. So the other main ones are the ones that sit more at the side of your buttocks, the gluteus medius and gluteus maximus, and they more kick your legs out to the side or abduct them. They're the ones that, and they also externally rotate or turn your knees out. So they're the ones that will help your knees not to roll in, and they're the ones that will keep your pelvis level when you're walking and running. So more important for stability. Really, really important. And then there's deeper ones again called collectively, they have some fancy names, but collectively as a group, they sit really deep and they're quite small, and they're called the deep hip rotators. And basically they, internally or externally rotate the hip. So again, they really control, the knees rolling in and out when you're walking and running, and what's happening at the hip. Yeah. And if your hips and your feet and your knees aren't in the right position, then the rest of the body above it isn't either. So very important.
So for those that are really interested in, the biomechanics and the anatomy, what are some of the names of those smaller, lesser known buttock muscles, those that are like super focused on their training? And then part B of that question is, how do those deep hip rotators, those glute stabilizers carry over into everyday life, in everyday activities and even sports?
Yeah, sure. So there's quite a few of them. You have the piriformis, which is one of the bigger ones, but it's often one of the ones that's actually a little bit tight and overworked compared to the others if the other ones are weak. So it's not one we probably focus so much on. But you have your superior and inferior gemelli and your obturator internus and externus and quadratus femoris. And they all control movement of the femur within the hip socket.
The femur's the
thigh bone.
Yeah.
Yep. And essentially they stop the knees rolling in and the hips rotating inwards, and the arches of the feet dropping in that mechanism. So functional for walking, for running, even if you're doing something like skiing, anything where you need control of the lower limbs and not letting the knees roll in. If you're going from sitting to standing, it can be why people get knee pain with squatting, if you're letting your knees kind of tip in towards each other. So all of those glutes.
What about sports, things like soccer, hockey?
Yeah, anything where you're doing single leg and running, basically. anything where you have to plant a leg and kick, that knee needs to be nice and straight and facing forward. The hip and pelvis need to be stable. You get way more power from every running step as well if your stability muscles are working properly. So, if you look at those track athletes, those ones that are running under 10 seconds for 100 meters, those muscles in those guys, very, very strong, all of the glute muscles. And you'll see it when you look at them too. They have these big, big, big glutes, but it's all of the muscles that are strong, and that's what gives them that power for running and also stops them from getting injured. And when you see people who, often people will want to take up a sport or take up running or, whatever it might be, if they're not strong in those muscles, they are asking for injuries to happen.
So regardless of whether you're trying to run the 100 meters under 10 seconds or just, maybe push the shopping cart down the shopping cart aisle at your local supermarket, regardless of what you're doing, the level of activity, those muscles need to be strong. They need to be functioning effectively, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, before doing Pilates, I worked as a physio, and just about every single, I don't know that I ever had any person that came in that would have lower limb overuse issues. I'm not talking about trauma where they've been in an accident, but, overuse, injuries or back pain or hip pain, who weren't weak in those muscles. And back then when I worked more as a physio, you only see people that are injured. So I kind of thought, maybe everyone's weak in those muscles. It wasn't until I really started teaching Pilates more and more that, when you would do an initial, screening or assessment on people, clients would come in and you would go, what injuries do you have? And they would say, I've got none. You've got no injuries at all. Never. No. And then when they'd start doing the exercises and you'd have a look at their stability, it was phenomenal, and that's why they don't have any injuries, is because naturally, inherently, they're strong in those muscles.
And finally, let's talk about the shoulders and neck, and how those deep stabilizing muscles work. And then, what we do in Studio Pilates in order to strengthen those, and, what sort of problems can arise if those are weak?
Sure. We'll start with the shoulders first, but they all kind of tie in together. Shoulder blade position is really important for shoulder pain and problems, and it's also important for neck pain as well. And a lot of us, we all sit at computers and on our phones and we're like this all day with our shoulders rounded and our chins poking forward. And when we do that, obviously it puts the neck in a bad position and the shoulders in a bad position, predisposes you to getting neck and shoulder pain. But the muscles which kind of counteract those bad postures specifically, for the shoulder blades, they're called the lower trapezius, middle trapezius, and rhomboids. And they're the muscles that sit behind your shoulder blades, that go from your shoulder blades into your spine. And what they do is pull your shoulder blades back and down, because when you walk around in life, if you walk around with your shoulders hunched up here, these upper trapezius muscles get really tight and affect your neck.
Then what's the flow and effect
Neck
of
pain, headaches, and if your shoulders are rounded really forward because they're not being pulled back by those muscles, again, you can get shoulder pain. So working on the muscles that really pull the shoulders down and back, super important. That's why it's also cued in every single exercise before you even move to pull the shoulder blades down and back, to put them in the right position and activate those muscles. The shoulder blades can also wing out, look a bit like chicken wings sticking out the back of your back. Everyone's probably either seen someone or know someone who has that, like a lot of people do. That's the serratus anterior. That's another stabilizer of the shoulder, and it actually, those muscles draw the shoulder blades in to sit against the ribs so that they don't stick out. And if those muscles are weak, particularly when you're doing things like planks or push-ups and your shoulder blades stick out, your body collapses through, you lose your shoulder stability, again, predisposing yourself to shoulder injuries. And for the neck, the main ones are the deep neck flexors. Obviously, you need good shoulder control if you've got neck pain, so you're not tightening the upper trapezius, but deep neck flexors sit through here. They tuck your chin in and stop you from being in that, head forward position. So again, cue you'll hear all the time is chin tucked in before you even move, before we do anything. So it's really important to have all of the stabilizing muscles on before and during any exercise in Pilates. And that's one of the main focuses and why it's so effective for injury prevention and rehab.
And all of the Studio Pilates instructors, they learn all of this through the, their training, through the training academy, and before they even become, instructors. Talk to us a little bit more about that, how that's infused in the training.
Sure. I mean, it's so important to have instructors who know how to identify if someone is or isn't activating the right muscles. You don't learn that in all Pilates training courses. We focus a lot more on that, I would say, than most, if not all, training providers that I'm aware of. There may be others that have more of a focus on that, but it is something that we definitely do differently than a lot of other providers, is focusing on that. And that's because if you don't have that right, you're just strengthening the wrong muscles and you're not correcting the imbalances that cause people's injuries in the first place. So the instructors learn in-depth anatomy, ways to identify right from wrong, both verbal and verbal and tactile cues, to actually get the best result for the clients and to try to get them into the right positions.
And so if you're a Studio Pilates customer and an instructor is coming around and, sticking their fingers into muscles, then maybe it's in between the shoulder blades, or, it's into the abs, into the, sides of the glutes or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They're obviously, searching for that muscle activation of those small muscle groups, so talk to us a little bit more about that. You mentioned it before, that proprioception, that activation of, like, when you're sticking your finger into the muscle, what does that do between that mind-muscle connection?
It helps so much, because it even for someone like me who has done so much Pilates, if someone is putting their hands on the muscle that I should be activating, it is just 1,000 times easier for your brain to focus on actually doing it. So, having the muscles kind of palpated and touched and guided throughout class, particularly if you're someone that finds them hard to activate, is really essential. And it's very helpful. It just guides you as to where you should be, tightening the muscles, and it actually stimulates the muscles to activate. So yeah, very important. That's why it's done, of course, in the class. So, but yeah, really important tool.
Yeah, very good. Well, thanks for sharing, Tanya. I mean, that's some really incredible insight, and I'm sure a lot of people have got a lot of value out of that. So, appreciate you unboxing all that information, and yeah, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think the thing is, and I know this, like, we've obviously trained a lot of Pilates instructors, and a lot of Pilates instructors come from being clients, and that's why they want to do the course, become instructors and help others. It's very rewarding. But until you actually start teaching and get into it and learn all of these things, you don't realize how technical it is.
Good point.
It's something that's always surprises people when they're doing the course, to know that actually, yeah, the technique is so important, and the little fine tuning and little things that sometimes as a client you might be like, oh, right, do I have to change that? The instructor will tell you every time to keep making the same correction, but it is really important. And yeah, the instructors spend a lot of time learning all the ins and outs of that.
And so really, the scientific approach, it's infused in every exercise, every word that's spoken by the instructor or from the voiceover, even down to the exercise selection, to, those, things that are reinforced, even the things like that core first policy. We're using that core before using a lot of those other larger stabilizing muscles, and moving on, we're starting with the abdominals in each workout. Again, that core first policy, that's all part of that deeper level of science, that deeper level of research, and that deeper level of...
Absolutely. And I mean, you've got to think, Joseph Pilates was amazing, and he was way ahead of his time in creating this phenomenal, workout, but back then we didn't have all the science that we do now. There's been a lot more research done in, exercise physiology, physiotherapy since it was all created. And you've also got to remember, most of his first clients were dancers. And a lot of the dancers have naturally, inherently amazing core muscle activation. So I guess the original method, and it is phenomenal, but these days probably more people are doing Pilates who don't have such amazing core activation. In general, over the decades, we're more sedentary. I think people in general have become posturally worse because of things like computers and phones. So traditional Pilates has, I guess, whilst it focuses on technique and it's amazing, there's probably less focus on correct muscle activation and using that modern science. So just kind of integrated the two together.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Tanya. It's been amazing. And yeah.
Thanks, Jade.